Hey everyone, welcome back to the channel. It's Luigi from Luigi's Play, and today we're diving into a topic that I know many of you have been curious about, the legality of emulation, emulators, and ROMs. If you're into gaming like me, especially with all the emulators we chat about here, this question has probably crossed your mind a few times. Are these things actually legal? Is there any risk involved? And more importantly, are they safe to use? Let's break it all down today. Are emulators legal? First up, let's tackle the big question. Are emulators legal? I know you've probably wondered about this, especially if you've downloaded something like Semu, Yuzu, or Citra. So, is it okay to use these programs? Well, here's the deal. Emulators, in and of themselves, are legal. Let me explain. Emulators are simply software tools designed to mimic the functionality of a game console or handheld system. In other words, they just simulate the hardware. Think of it like a virtual machine, but for gaming. The act of creating software that replicates a console isn't illegal because there's nothing wrong with designing software that mimics hardware. But here's where things get tricky. The legality of emulators depends heavily on how you're using them. Let's say you download an emulator like Citra to play 3DS games. But where did you get the game files? If you bought the game and made a backup for personal use, you're in the clear. But if you downloaded a game from the internet, well, that's where we hit some legal gray areas. More on that later when we discuss ROMs. So, to wrap it up, emulators are legal as long as you're not violating any intellectual property laws. The software itself is harmless, it's how you use it that matters. Now, this might sound confusing because you're probably thinking, wait, isn't emulation the same thing as using an emulator? Not exactly. When we talk about emulation, we're referring to the entire process of using software to imitate a console. So, is emulation legal? Let's break it down. Emulation is a concept, not a product. The idea of replicating how something works doesn't violate any laws. It's a method, not an action that can be deemed illegal by itself. Think of it this way. If I design a chair that looks like a famous design, am I breaking the law? Not necessarily. It depends on whether I'm copying someone's patented design or creating my own version inspired by it. So in gaming, the act of emulating a console to run a game is legal if you're doing it in a way that doesn't break copyright law. Remember, the law focuses on the game files, not the emulator or the process itself. Now, this is a question we've all had at some point. Are emulators safe to download? After all, we don't want to end up with a virus or some kind of malware on our system, right? The short answer, yes, emulators can be safe, but it depends on where you get them from. Here's the thing. Emulators are like any other software out there. If you download them from trusted sources like official websites or well-known developers, you should be fine. For example, downloading Yuzu from its official website is much safer than getting it from some random forum or shady website. However, the problem arises when you go to unreliable sites that host sketchy versions of emulators. These could come with malware, viruses, or unwanted software that can mess up your system. So you've got to be careful and always check the source. And let me also add this, be cautious with emulators that seem too good to be true. If you see something claiming to run every game flawlessly without any issues, there's a chance it's a scam. To sum up, stick to official sources, read reviews, and if you're ever in doubt, do a quick search to see what others are saying about the emulator. It's better to be safe than sorry. Are ROMs legal? Okay, now here's the part that probably confuses most people. We've talked about emulators, but what about the actual game files? The ROMs. So, are ROMs legal? This is where things get dicey. The short answer is no, most ROMs are not legal, but with some exceptions. Let me explain. When you buy a game, you own the physical or digital copy of it. However, the intellectual property rights of the game are still owned by the company that created it. What does this mean? It means that copying or distributing the game without permission is illegal because it violates copyright law. But there's a loophole, and this is what many people argue. If you own the game, you have the right to make a backup copy for personal use. So, if you own a cartridge of Pokemon on the 3DS, you can legally dump your own ROM and play it on Citra. The issue comes when people start downloading ROMs they don't own from websites. That's illegal. plain and simple. All right, so we've established that most ROMs are illegal unless you're backing up games that you legally own. But why is there so much confusion around this? Let's break it down. One reason people think ROMs are legal is how easy they are to find on the internet. You've probably seen countless websites offering downloads of your favorite games, but just because they're available doesn't mean they're legal. Here's an analogy. Imagine you walk into a store and see a product sitting on the shelf. It's right there, but just because it's out in the open doesn't mean it's free for the taking, right? The same logic applies to ROMs. Just because someone uploads a ROM online doesn't make it legal to download. In fact, the person who uploaded the ROM is already breaking the law by distributing it. But here's where the gray area comes in. A lot of older games, like those for the NES, SNES, or Sega Genesis, are no longer sold or available. These games are often referred to as abandonware because the original creators don't make money from them anymore. Some gamers argue that downloading these ROMs shouldn't be illegal because there's no other way to get them. While that argument makes sense morally, it doesn't change the legal status. Even if a company isn't selling a game anymore, they still technically own the rights to it. That means downloading it without permission is still against the law. So if you ever wonder, but what about games that I can't buy anymore? The answer remains the same. Downloading ROMs is illegal unless you own the game or have permission from the copyright holder. So why do people still download ROMs if they're illegal? Let's be real, it happens a lot, and here's why. First, for some people, it's the easiest way to access old games. There are tons of classic games from systems like the Nintendo 64, PlayStation 1, or Game Boy Advance that are nearly impossible to find in stores today. If you want to relive the nostalgia of playing Super Mario 64 or Pokemon Fire Red, finding an original copy could be expensive or straight up impossible. For a lot of gamers, downloading a ROM is their only option. Second, it's convenient. Emulators let you play games on your PC or Android phone, and for some people, that's a better experience than hunting down an old console. Plus, you can enhance the games, use cheats, and even apply mods. It makes playing these old games more fun. But remember, convenience doesn't make it legal. The law is clear. Downloading ROMs you don't own is a violation of copyright. That's why companies like Nintendo have been cracking down on ROM sites in recent years. You might have heard about big lawsuits against ROM websites. Companies like Nintendo are known for taking legal action to protect their intellectual property. So while downloading ROMs is common, it's not without risks. Not only is it illegal, but websites that host ROMs could disappear at any moment due to legal pressure. Here's the million-dollar question. Is there any way to legally use ROMs? The answer is yes, but it's limited. If you legally own a game, you can create a backup for yourself. This means you could use software or hardware tools to dump the game files into a ROM that you can play on an emulator. For example, if you own a copy of The Legend of Zelda: Ocarina of Time for the Nintendo 64, you're allowed to make a backup and use that ROM on an emulator. But there's a catch. You can only create ROMs for personal use. You cannot distribute them, upload them to the internet, or share them with friends. The moment you start sharing those files, you're breaking copyright law. In fact, making your own backups is often more complicated than just downloading a ROM from the internet. You'll need specific hardware and software to do it, which can be a hassle. But if you want to stay on the right side of the law, that's the safest and legal way to go. Now let's talk about the risk. What's the worst that could happen if you download a ROM? Well, technically, downloading a ROM is a violation of copyright law, and in a worst-case scenario, you could be sued by the game's copyright holder. However, this rarely happens to individual users. Most of the time, companies like Nintendo go after the websites that distribute ROMs, not the people who download them. But that doesn't mean you're completely safe. In theory, if a company wanted to, they could take legal action against you for downloading their games illegally. You might also run into issues with your internet provider if they detect that you're downloading copyrighted material. Another risk is malware. Some ROM websites are filled with ads, pop-ups, and shady downloads that could infect your device. If you're not careful, you could end up with a virus that's much more trouble than the ROM itself. So, while it's unlikely that you'll face legal trouble for downloading a ROM, there's always a risk. And even if you don't get in trouble, there's the ethical question. Are you okay with playing games that you didn't pay for? When it comes to ROMs and emulation, there's a debate in the gaming community. Some people believe that emulating games, especially older ones that aren't sold anymore, isn't wrong. They argue that if the company isn't making money off the game anymore, they shouldn't care if people are still playing it. After all, if it's an abandoned game, who's really losing out? But others say that the law is the law, and whether or not the company is making money off a game doesn't matter. They argue that by downloading ROMs, you're still taking something that doesn't belong to you. At the end of the day, it's up to you to decide where you stand on this issue. Legally, it's clear that downloading ROMs without owning the game is against copyright law. But ethically, some people feel like it's not that big of a deal, especially for older games. So, let's recap everything we've talked about. Are emulators legal? Yes, they are. Emulation as a concept is perfectly legal as long as you're not using it to break copyright laws. Emulators are just software, and there's nothing wrong with downloading and using them. But when it comes to ROMs, things get a little more complicated. Unless you own the game and are making a backup for personal use, downloading ROMs is illegal. The same goes for sharing ROMs with others. It's important to understand that while emulators are legal, the game files, the ROMs, are usually not unless you own them. Finally, emulators are generally safe to download if you stick to trusted sources. But as with any software, be careful where you download from. Thanks for joining me today. If you have any more questions or thoughts about emulation and ROMs, feel free to drop them in the comments. Don't forget to like and subscribe for more gaming insights. Happy gaming, everyone!